Hello, listener. So I'd like to give a little bit of some thoughts on why metapolitics and cultural change are actually more important than attaining direct political power. I'll give you an example of this. The Prohibition in the United States in the 1920s. Now, the Prohibition came about out of a fairly popular, fairly large Protestant Christian movement against alcoholism and against it was part of a broader movement against moral decay and so on. This was the what is often called the progressive era, where the progressive era in this sense was a Christian progressive era, and it was very much concerned with implementing a very strict Christian morality, eugenics, the most modern science within a Christian moral context, and so on. And you had presidents like Woodrow Wilson who were representative of this, and so on. And they wanted to basically change the United States into a more Christian nation. So one of the things they did was, they got into government and they passed prohibition. And everyone knows that what happened. Prohibition failed because, there was a market incentive, gangsters jumped on the opportunity to make money, and there was still too many consumers who wanted to drink alcohol. How would metapolitics and cultural change have succeeded here? Well, they should have basically evangelized rather than try and get power and through force put their policies in practice. It's better to convince the general culture and change the general culture to oppose the consumption of alcohol. Prohibition leagues and so on, and abstinence leagues were growing and popular all the way from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And it was a growing movement. It was a growing organic movement, this progressive movement. And really, if they had just let things go on and had continued to push on that cultural level of trying to basically convince people on the strength of their arguments, convince them through cultural means, convince them by, group dynamics, social pressure and so on, then you would have achieved more. It would take maybe a century or maybe even more, but you can fundamentally change a culture to stop having certain traditions or habits. I mean, drinking alcohol is very ingrained in European culture, and you can't think that just with some harsh laws and repression you can just change a tradition that is several millennia old, and which is very customary among the majority of the adult population. So if you want to do something like that, and certainly if you have a certain cultural momentum going, what you want to do is get that metapolitics going. Publish literature, hit the cobbles, talk to people on the street, get institutions. I mean, how did the Marxists get all this cultural power? They went bottom up and top down from all sides that they could to get cultural power. They didn't really pass restrictive laws. They're doing it now. But the thing with laws is when you're trying to legislate something, it's because it's already gotten so far out of common practice that you have to use force to try and get people to conform to what you want. And it's much better to use soft power for these sorts of things. And the left has understood that up until now quite well. You take the media, you take the arts, you take the sciences. Well, not the hard sciences, but the culturally influential sciences. The historians, the sociologists, the psychologists, the art teachers, teachers in general. In fact, that's where you try and push your influence. You try and influence the curricula of the school, so everyone from a young age is educated with these sorts of values. And many people never critically think, never ever look at the assumptions that they're passed on to them by their hierarchical superiors, their teachers, community elders, and so on. Most people don't really critically look at any of the assumptions that their civilization passes to them, and they just kind of assume that as being normal and carry on with their lives without really thinking about it. It has to be very egregiously contrary to nature or natural law for them to question it. George Orwell illustrates this perfectly well in 1984, where the proles basically believe themselves to be perfectly happy and free, because what reason do they have to complain? I mean, yes, economically the situation isn't great, but they're not thinkers. It's the intellectual dissident who has an issue with the party because he has intellectual disagreements. And that's what gets him into conflict. If he were simply mindless and not critically looking at his own assumptions about the world and just accepting the worldview that he's presented, there's no reason to bother. Really, it's the same way in this modern liberal society. You want to live your life and not be an intellectual dissident, there's really nothing to fear in terms of repression or anything. You can, within a liberal society, you can really express yourself just about any way that's degenerate that you want. In just about every individual outing you could be. The only things you can't be is authoritarian, moralistic in an opposite sense of the leftist morals. It's basically, if you challenge the assumptions of the society, if you're a thought criminal, then you're dangerous. If you're just using drugs and so on, and just living your life, or just a normal worker and consumer, you're not interesting enough to repress. And in most societies, you'll be just fine. Whether that's like a 1984 style society, a modern liberal society, an autocratic dictatorship. If you're politically unconcerned, you'll be fine. If you're philosophically disinterested, you'll be fine, really. So yeah, if you want to, and that's why, culture really matters, and arts really matter, and philosophy really matters. And I think Prohibition is a great example of how you cannot, through sheer force, try and change a culture. And you'll see the left run up against this too. They're pushing too hard, and they're trying to use force through law and through not just soft power but violence in the streets at this point. They're trying to push their agenda so hard it's going to go to a breaking point, and it'll go just the same way as Prohibition did. It'll keep escalating. It'll empower the opposition, because the gangsters became extremely rich. Drinking culture, if anything, became cool and underground and against the establishment and so on. The forbidden fruit and all that. And you'll see that that's what's happening with the youth currently. Youth is moving towards the right, especially because internet culture is moving rapidly towards the right. So this sort of thing will eventually backfire on you if you try to force through ideas, if you try to push it hard enough. The left was very successful, and they were doing it all metapolitically, when they were just basically taking over institutions and saying, well, this is normal. Why are you holding on to all these old ideas? Monarchy, traditional marriage, that's all relics of the past. It doesn't matter. Here, look, I've written a book about it. Here's a play. It's a play satirizing the traditional funding. Here, you've got a movie that's attacking Christianity because Christianity is just oppression. Oh, here's a poem about the evils of colonialism. All that sort of thing. That's how you switch a culture's thinking, and then if you switch the zeitgeist, you switch the thinking of the mass of the people. And again, the mass of the people do not critically look at the assumptions that are given to them unless you go too far against their interests or you go too far against natural principles. They'll accept destroying the traditional family. But if you start saying it's sexist to not sleep with a transgender, that's a bit much for most people. And if you say, well, why can't two people just do whatever they want? You'll get quite a lot of, because people have a naturally disgust response against homosexuality. But you can get that. Look, most people will be all right, fine, sure, they can do what they want. But then you get 9-year-old drag kids, and you have children at gay pride parades, and then people are like, whoa, 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 that's going too far. That's corrupting the youth. That's not individual choice. Children can't make choices like that. So you'll get that autoimmune response when you go too hard against natural law, and that's why leftism can never work, because it's all of its ideals about equality and so completely go against nature, and nature eventually always wins. Anyway, that's why we should do metaculture, metapolitics, and metacultural work. We should try and make art, literature, try and influence people on the street. And winning elections doesn't really matter. It's completely secondary. It's like with marching through the streets. Any protest only serves to push an agenda through. When you have people on the streets, it's only useful if then you have someone in power who can point at them and say, see, this is what the people think. Therefore, we have to pass this law, because that's what they demand. And therefore, protests on the street only facilitate the pushing through of policies of your movement, of your ideas. A protest that has no means to capitalize on political change is meaningless. So focus first on getting the mass of the people, then get someone in power, then go onto the streets. Don't go onto the streets and don't try and win elections before you've got a mental landscape that is taking shape and convincing people. And the internet's doing a good job at that, but you need more. You need to start engaging high culture. You need to start engaging mass culture, not just video games. So that's kind of my take on it. Yeah.